Right.
What's interesting is, about this discussion is that when you talk about tanks, people have a very one-dimensional view of what a tank is. And sometimes I don't think that's very helpful, just to think of it as a big gun on a track platform. And, when we start to talk about future capability, maybe the tank of the future is not in the traditional mold, but it has to do the same thing and do it better. So, I think that's the sort of mindset we've got to get over a bit.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there's been stuff in the public domain for years, isn't there, from DARPA and others that have looked at what, if the future tank might look like, in terms of, very different approach to mobility, very, far more kind of sensors and networking and all kind of, a kind of F-35 on the ground, effectively, for better or for worse with that analogy. So yeah, I completely agree. In some respects, they're quite a kind of agricultural bit of machinery compared to some of the other, platforms we use, because they're very, tried and tested, and there's, as we've discussed, there is merit in having a large slab of steel in front of you. But yeah, certainly in future it could look different. And so I guess that's where the UK, the UK needs to be thinking is, okay, well, what capability obviously do we need in 10, 20, 30 years? The question, of course, is how do you separate what the art of the possible might be for future technology, future concepts of operations, from the reality and the risks that come with that? Because there's also always the danger of just technology hype, and we've seen it with kind of talks about things like electric armor or whatever. For years, actually not really coming to fruition, anytime soon necessarily. So we need to make sure that the army isn't using, well, not the army, sorry, the army's paymasters are not kind of using technology and innovation as just kind of watchwords to cover for taking risk. We need to not just assume that technology will magically solve all of our problems for us. And that's a kind of it's a peculiarly Western and Anglo-Saxon way of thinking. And certainly other nations don't put so much stock in technology. They put stock in what works, and they put stock in, having good operational art and having good strategy and having good, personnel to execute it, and enough of them. So yeah, we need to think about what future vision of a tank might be, but also not going to get too carried away as perhaps some in government, particularly outside of the military, might be prone to do.
Yeah, well, that's it. I'm sorry, Paddy, I cut you off. Please go ahead.
I was going to add, firstly, grasping Nicholas's point, yes, we talk about tanks too much, and we all know it's all arms warfare. We should be talking about armoured warfare, not tank warfare. And what does armoured warfare give you that unarmoured, disarmoured, whatever, warfare doesn't? Armoured warfare exists to give you, at what the Russians would call the operational level, manoeuvre. If you don't have armour, you're going to end up in fighting attritional, static battles, because the battle space is too damn dangerous to do anything else. If the defensive firepower will always trump what the offense can bring to it. And we should be thinking more about manoeuvre warfare, and most other armies aren't. And the British Army has, the greatest strengths and weakness of the British Army encapsulated in a regimental system. And whereas when the RAF fight the Navy, the cavalry fight the infantry, and everyone hates the artillery. On and on it goes. But the answer is yes. It's manoeuvre. It's how do we manoeuvre as fast as we can in a potentially lethal environment that we're not quite sure about till we get there, and that's what armour should bring in.
Well, thank you, everybody. So we've got to get on to the last item. So this was the last item on our list to discuss, and that is the possibility for indirect fire and for drones to do two things. One of two or both of these things. One is to replace the tank or replace some tanks. So maybe we can kill the enemy's tanks with these new platforms, or with highly sophisticated direction of indirect fire, or swarming them with drones. So which drones seem to be particularly popular, or not popular, but particularly topical for Dominic Cummings in this integrated defence review. So can they replace tanks or some tanks, or do they, on the enemy's side, do they argue for the deletion or partial deletion of our tanks? In other words, the argument from Russia's performance in Ukraine and to some extent operations in Syria is that the tank is less viable because of the precision fires, indirect fires, and the use of drones, both to direct those fires and even to swarm things like active protection systems. So can we discuss that? Who's first? Who's brave enough to go there?
I mean, I'll start with some comments. I mean, I think the danger is in framing them as an either or. You know, should the army have tanks or should it have more long range fires? Because clearly it needs more long range fires, but ideally that's not at the expense of having tanks also. And certainly, if the question is, does the UK currently have enough long range fires, be they delivered by the army or delivered by the air force or whatever, you know, the navy in a littoral environment? You know, the answer is clearly no, and it's something that has been extensively discussed. It's been extensively war gamed. It's been, you know, there's a lot of discussion around. Well, in the West, we frequently call kind of A2AD, anti-area access denial. Obviously, none of the Russians or Chinese actually call it that, which tells you that it's a very Western preoccupation and conceptualization of what they're doing. But there's a lot of kind of long-range surface-to-air missiles and integrated air defense systems, tube artillery, MLRS, all these sorts of things that are enabling Russia and other countries to hold the US and its allies at range and engage in kind of the deep fight, the deep battle, which is something that we've obviously not had to do for the last 30 years. We've obviously enjoyed air superiority. We've been able to rely on calling in, you know, tornadoes and then more recently typhoons and predator drones and so on, and just deliver airstrikes whenever we need to. Clearly, that's not going to be the case going forward. We're not going to have such a benign air domain. We're not going to have such a benign electromagnetic spectrum. So we're going to have far more jamming and spoofing and getting in the way of our basic comms and ability to call in fires. So it's a really tough and much more lethal threat environment that we're facing today, and certainly in 5-10 years time. And currently, you know, the UK simply doesn't have the range in terms of the artillery that we do have, but also it certainly doesn't have the mass, the scale, and also that, you know, it's not just about having enough tubes. It's also obviously about having enough rounds to put through those tubes, and also the ability to then, you know, target them downrange in the first place and then do battle damage assessment and all these sorts of things. And if you look at the size of the Royal Artillery, the number of Watchkeeper drones and other assets that we have, you know, and then you compare it to what the Russians have in the Western Military District, it's like night and day. So do we have enough to replace tanks? No. To your question of can kind of range and increasing emphasis on precision solve some of our problems? I mean, yes, certainly there've been notable advances and things like the Excalibur round for, that means you can suddenly start using one, and it's because it's kind of semi-guided or guided, you know, you can use one rather than 10 to have an effect. That's clearly attractive. There's a lot of stuff that us with some of our allies like Norway, the US have been doing around increasing the range of otherwise kind of fairly traditional, cheap and cheerful artillery. All of those are good. There's obviously a lot that's been done, a lot that is being done, I would say, around improving anti-tank guided weapons. So you're seeing, you know, improved sensing capabilities, more ability to draw on inputs from multiple sensors and then join that with multiple shooters, kind of improved survivability for the poor suckers who have to hold the system and fire it. So, you know, there are some kind of significant advances across the board. The question is just whether all of those kind of marginal gains are sufficient to replace what you got with a tank. Then I don't think that they, you know, individually add up to that. And the question, of course, is if we do get rid of main battle tanks, do you then end up just opening yourself up to saying, well, we'll rely on a mix of you know, drones and shoulder launched systems and this and that and the other, and then you just salami slice each of those in future as well. So there's not a guarantee that if you kind of surrender one capability and we say we'll just replace it with this other mix, that's necessarily going to give you the effect in the first place. And even if it does, it's not a guarantee that it's going to be useful in 5-10 years. As things move on. So yeah, I think it's a real struggle, and certainly if you look at what other countries are doing, they are far above and beyond us in terms of range, lethality, and scale. And the crucial difference is they get to do that on their own turf, right? You know, they are largely assuming they're going to fight a near peer or peer adversary in their near abroad, or perhaps on their own border. The deployability of their forces is very minimal. But that's fine. So they get all the benefits, the tactical advantages of that, whereas we're going to have to go kick the door in, and that's that is a real struggle for us. Also, a final point just to note there is we therefore have to plan for more scenarios. So we have to design systems, we have to design guided weapons, we have to design drones that are going to work in different scenarios. They're going to work in the cold, they're going to work in the humid, they're going to work in the desert, they're going to work in the dry. They're going to work at altitude, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that places a lot of extra complexity and cost on the engineering, and also on the doctrine and the concepts of operations. Whereas if you're Russia, you can broadly say, well, we know exactly where we're going to be fighting. We know what the conditions are going to be, and then you can design your weapon system around that. So it's a comparatively straightforward challenge they have, whereas we have to plan for so many different eventualities.
Well, we do. I mean, I'll just note that, I mean, one way to mitigate the expeditionary costs is to forward deploy again in Europe. And I don't mean these sort of fake heavy armored brigade deployments that we've got at the moment in the Baltics, they're called brigades, but they're skeleton brigades at best. I mean, you could, and they sort of surge, right? They surge during exercises and then they come back to Britain. I mean,
they're tripwire forces.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could forward deploy them and build all the logistical sustainment assets you would need. That would sort of mitigate some of those expeditionary uncertainties. But what, Paddy, Nicholas, what do you think?
I think the advent of the Brimstone missile is extremely important. Initially, as an air-launched system, it's been hugely effective because it has this precision effect. I mean, it really works very well indeed. And the ground launch version basically gives you a non-line of sight beyond visual range system. So if you can imagine having a large quantity of Brimstones, 40 kilometers back, and you have a forward infantry force who are well concealed, that could be a very effective means of taking out a large number of tanks. So you wouldn't need to rely on tanks in that situation necessarily, although you might want them for certain scenarios. So the advent of very sophisticated long-range anti-tank missiles, I think, makes a big difference, a huge uplift in capability. And of course, you can mount Brimstone on a drone as well. Although actually, I see drones being used more for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Not really for mounting anti-tank weapons as such. You start losing them, it becomes very expensive very quickly. In terms of long-range fires, deep fires, a 155 howitzer can reach 75 to 100 kilometers is becoming a reality. But also we've got the MRS system and GMRS system, and obviously that will continue to be very important. I'd like to see something like a precision strike missile added to that, which sort of brings you very quickly. Do we need to have tactical nuclear weapons in order to stop a very determined thrust from a potential enemy? Because if Russia did a very large land grab in the Baltics, how long would it be before the nuclear option was on the table? maybe James has got a view on that. So, you know, there's a lot we can do to augment the power of tanks through artillery, right down to handheld anti-tank weapons.
Yeah, which is where we were 40 years ago in the Cold War. I mean, yes, historically we've never had enough artillery. I vividly remember doing a simulation of a Russian attack on Warsaw Pact attack on a Western battalion position, dug in, and by the time the fire mission was over, there was no tension that had not been struck by at least one round of 1 to 2 millimeter caliber, or bigger. Longer range, yes, it will come. The deep strike thing, again, has been around forever, and it's great. Precision fire, yes. How precise? If you're talking about effectively, if the argument being made is we don't need to have a tank to kill this armoured vehicle coming towards us because we can get it with something else 20 clicks down the road. If that's motoring, that's quite a big ask. Even today, it's quite a big ask, and it's quite a big, clever sensor system that can hit something at short notice, fired from a launcher that's laid on a shooting scoot that's come very quickly into position, very quickly had to aim, acquire targets, dispatch its payload, and get back. And that element is the difficult bit. In terms of the lethality, well, everyone knows that there's less armour on the top for a tank. Perhaps things like the Israeli trophy system make it slightly less vulnerable, and that could be evolved. But I think the thing that we forget is that if we pop out our MRAV launcher to engage the enemy when he's 50 kilometres from what used to be called the feeble, from the close battle, we've now declared where that unit is, and most people would believe quite strongly in counter battery fire. And quite a lot of people say, well, that makes MLRS or its successors a force multiplier. We're only a force multiplier while you're alive. The sooner you lose it, the more likely you are to lose it. And I think that is something that's not often modelled correctly. And James already made the point, if we're going to fire them a lot, it would be nice to have lots and lots of rockets in quick load containers, because we're going to be shipping them out like Walk's Drift on a bad day. The drone thing, yes, existing use of drones or RPVs to observe that will increase, and obviously we need more. The specific of the swarming drone, I don't get. I don't get it as being something new. Effectively, it's what we've been talking about as precision fire, and it is brimstone. Maybe you fire a lot of them and they talk to each other a bit, but how do they get there? And what did they come off? I mean, did they come off a $100 million fighter jet? Well, that's a very expensive way to, knock a few holes in a few armored vehicles. Did it come out of an attackams? Well, fine, then you've used it, and there'll be a brief pucker moment when everyone wondered what warhead that attackams had on it as it was heading off on a ballistic trajectory. So I don't think that that's a game changer. And I think it's on, and I did quite a lot of work looking at the swarming drones, and it's only a clever missile, and it's probably quite a slow one, or it comes attached to something very big that you'd have seen anyway. So I don't think there's a game changer. The nuance of the equation: do you want more tube artillery? Do you want more panzers? Do you want more armoured infantry? Well, the correct answer is if you're the British Army, the correct answer is we need a hell of a lot more than anything, because otherwise we're just, putting up a Potemkin village pretending we're real hardcore heavy metal army, which is pretty much where we came in. I mean, at some stage, there's going to be a defence review that's done by someone who's on this and say, do you know what, boys, we might need to spend a little bit more than we budgeted on this.
Yeah. So on that note.
but tombstones and poppies are cheap, and British Army still does drill fantastic.
Yeah.
I remember this.
I actually entirely agree with you. So I've had 20 years working on and off with the MOD, and always been frustrated with the stereotypes of short-term thinking and short-term desk jockeys, right? The old problem about people spending 3 years on an acquisitions desk and programs run for 20. So I quite agree with you on that point. I think that would be the That would be the message when we package this and send it to the MOD to help them conclude this review. So gentlemen, I'll give you a last chance to address anything you thought that we did not address, any final thoughts, any corrections, anything that you think needs to be said before we sign off.
I think it might be worth just discussing very briefly what the next generation of tank is likely to look like. And of course, a big indication of that 2014. And I can see, you know, 3 trends in future tanks that I think are going to be very obvious. And I'd be very interested to see Patrick and James's views on this as well. So the first trend is they're going to be much lighter. So, you know, more like 50 tons of basic weight with applique armor add-on packs. And how are they going to reduce the weight while maintaining the protection? They're going to have remote controlled turrets. They're going to have no one in the turret. And what that's going to do is going to isolate the crew from the ammunition, and that is going to dramatically increase survivability. And they're going to have smaller crews because of that. And the third trend is I think they're going to have much more powerful sensors and the ability to see the enemy way beyond the distance that the enemy can see them. And that is going to be the overmatch capability. Those are the 3 things I see happening.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the article you wrote on the future of the tank, and I think the one thing you didn't mention there was a much bigger gun, which gives you, you know, more range, and perhaps you can trade that off against armor and
yeah, since I wrote that, I've kind of changed my mind, because the latest 100mm PFSDS rounds produced by Germany and America would probably punch a hole clean through the Armata.
The limiting factor on the size of a tank is going to continue to be the road gauge or the rail gauge that it's working on. The limiting factor on the weight is it's 50 tons is ideal, but that's like saying to the infantry that you should only carry 30 kilos, and whenever you pick up an infantryman's pack, it always weighs about 60 because it's taken long some miles. I don't think the tank is going to physically get much bigger, which means that barring some leap through in technology akin to the creation of trouble armor, you're not actually going to need to knock your way through that much more steel to get into it, which means the gun size is going to stay at about 120. I mean, certainly the M60A2 and the M551 Sheridan had a reputation for trying to blow themselves apart whenever they fired a 152. So I think 120-ish is going to be about the same. And of course, there's all sorts of legacy reasons why people like that, because the ranges exist, the targetry exists, the ammunition exists, or can be extended on. So I don't think anyone's going to score much for doing that. I don't think that an unmanned turret works. I say this, having spent a lot of my life in a turret. There used to be a thing called the long armor course, which would regularly propose a theoretical tank with an unmanned gun, and it doesn't work. In the opinion of almost every tank commander I've ever met, is unhappy with the concept, because you will get disorientated when you're maneuvering at speed, which is actually what you're paid to do. And you lose all your reversionary modes. I mean, at the moment, you know, in a turreted tank, if the electronics go fine, start firing it by hand. If one set of sights goes, you've got 2, maybe 3 other ones to keep going to be able to fight the tank. So I think the Russians have made a very ballsy call with the T-14, and I suspect part of the delay in bringing it in is they might be finding that out. And so I think, yes, you know, the armoured envelope will come down in size a little bit because you probably lose crewmen. I don't think a 2-man tank crew is viable. I've been on 4-man and 3-man, and 3-man is hard work. I don't think 2-man happen. So I don't think we're going to see very much different. I think the McCarver layout versus the M1 layout's going to go several laps. But I don't see anyone bringing out anything game-changingly new, which I think kind of destroys the whole market. you know, if you had a Leopard 2A7 and you think, yeah, it's getting a bit rusty or whatever, you'd produce a Leopard 2A8, not a Leopard 3. If you had an M1C, well, you know, there's a whole alphabet left before you need to start worrying about changing things. If you're in the unfortunate position of having a Challenger, where you are constrained, and the only real problem with a Challenger is that it's at the limit of what you can do with its lethality because of the rifle barrel and the two-piece ammunition. It can't get a much longer penetrator. It can't get a much higher muzzle velocity. And putting another gun in the turret was designed round the L30 gun or whatever, and you put anything else in, it's a new turret, and that's where all the cost is. And it's very interesting, you know, the straight economic cost of whether it's cheaper to reuse a Challenger hull with a new turret. We might as well take the whole tank or someone else's, is going to mean, I suspect, why that'll be deemed politically unacceptable, and it will kick down the road and be a wonderful job for someone knocking out second-hand Challenger engines for a bit.
Can I jump in there? I mean,
yes,
KMW doesn't think that the Challenger LEP stacks up. It's basically been so increased in scope, it's a new tank now. And new tanks take 10 years to deliver, as Ajax and Warrior show. So it's a very risky program. If you're putting a new turret on Challenger 2, which is exactly what we are doing, we might as well buy a new tank. That's very much my view.
And then your question is Leopard, McCarver, or M1, or if you want lots of them, T90.
Good point. James, I'm going to give you the final word. Paddy just reminded me of one thing that we haven't discussed, and that is an infantry fighting vehicle variant of a main battle tank, because Paddy just mentioned the McCarver, and the Israelis have converted a lot of main battle tanks into infantry fighting vehicles because they want the same mobility and the same survivability alongside tanks. The Russians are doing that, and Western countries have often considered this, and people often forget that at the time of the procurement of the M1 Abrams, there was fully designed and required an IFV version of that. Didn't get procured in the end. So that's one note. That's another requirement that the MOD needs to consider, particularly if they're going to acquire a whole new tank. Do they also acquire an IFV variant of that tank and get the survivability, the genuine heavy armor survivability they need for their infantry alongside it? But that was my one note. So with that, James, you actually get the last word.
I mean, I think I was going to reflect on a couple of points, one of which speaks to what you were just saying. I mean, the first is to kind of agree vigorously with the list of future requirements set out by Nicholas and Patrick for what the future tank might look like. I think I would add to it, it's also the kind of the connectivity. So it's not just having the sensors, but obviously the ability to then fuse that and then share it. And so having a far more kind of networked force where you've got lots of different sensors and shooters that are all, not necessarily co-located, but able to very easily to move stuff around and coordinate in a way far beyond what they do today, I think is going to be really important. But obviously that brings in a lot of some technical challenges around how you do data links and so on, particularly given in the land domain you have pesky things like terrain in the way, which is more complicated than in the air domain or maritime. But also I think it speaks to my second point, which is going to be whatever the future capabilities look like, and be that tanks or be that a kind of infantry fighting vehicle variant, or be that some of the medium or lightweight stuff that we were talking about earlier. There needs to be a different approach to how they go about the whole kind of design philosophy, but crucially the acquisition philosophy from the MOD. Is if you're going to have all these new bells and whistles, if you can have this mixed force, and particularly in the UK case, where as we've said before, we're not going to be a huge customer that's buying enormous numbers of these and isn't able therefore to have that sway of industry and isn't able to get the economies of scale, the economies of learning in the production line. What we really need is an approach that is much more agile when it comes to acquisition. We need more modularity. We need more, kind of common systems, so that you can start, you know, taking one thing off one vehicle and put it on another vehicle, and it just plugs and plays and it works. And you're not on the hook to some original equipment manufacturer that probably went out of business 15 years ago. And that's all really important today anyway, for, you know, fairly chunky bits of metal that we have as the form of tanks. But then when you go 15 years in the future and we start talking about the things we've just been talking about around, you know, sensors, automation, what you're actually talking about there is you're talking about a lot of software. And if there's something that the MODs traditionally are worse at than buying large hunks of metal, it's buying software, and then maintaining and sustaining that over time. And, you know, I think we've all agreed that it's not, you know, kind of tolerable that it takes 10, 15 years to deliver a new vehicle. But it is absolutely going to be mad if it takes us 10 years to deliver a software update, because that's the kind of thing that, you know, can go out of date in a month or 6 months. So the MOD has got to have a far more long-term approach to this, and it's got to work really closely with industry to try and, you know, drive as much efficiency and sustainability and supportability into the design philosophy for programs. And then going back to the point you were making about earlier about having, you know, people in MOD who sit on an acquisition program for a couple of years and make short-term decisions, we need to try and resist that and actually commit to building a kind of genuine system of systems for the land domain that we're going to be able to support and sustain over time, both in terms of the physical platforms, but also all of the, you know, the information architecture that goes around it. And that's, you know, that's a huge challenge. So it's kind of really about dragging tanks into the kind of 21st century, but crucially, you know, dragging the people who buy tanks into the 21st century. And that's arguably the you know, that's a social and a cultural challenge. And so arguably it's harder than the engineering one.
Well said. Well, we have to close it there. And I sort of regret that, because I've enjoyed this discussion so much. And I can see all the different vectors we could go and explore together, because we've got great synergies between us. So let me close it by saying thank you very much for joining me and indirectly my students and the wider public. And I appreciate this is essentially a public service to share your knowledge and your analysis. So I thank you on behalf of the public. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
I hope we get
Thank you.
to do this again sometime.
My pleasure. Farewell. I hate long goodbyes.
Thank you all.